Hello, my name is Gemma Kremen, and I'll be making this presentation on behalf of the Tomorrow Cities Early Career Risk Working Group. Current risk modelling approaches comprise of some representation of hazard, exposure and vulnerability that are somehow combined into an impact or risk metric, and these type of analysis can be further leveraged for decision-making purposes. Now, this type of approach has a number of inherent limitations. The first is that they overwhelmingly focus on current exposure, hazard and vulnerability, thereby limiting their facilitation of risk-informed decision-making on tomorrow's cities, because each of these three components will change in the future. The next is that they tend to focus on single assets within the built environment, like buildings, failing to consider that cities are composed of interconnected physical and social networks. And this leads to very narrow visions of risk or impact, like economic loss, which simply does not capture the whole impact of a disaster on everyone within a society. The Tomorrow Cities project has developed an innovative decision support environment. And at the heart of this environment is a computational or risk engine that has been specifically designed to overcome the limitations previously mentioned. We focus exclusively on tomorrow's exposure, hazard and vulnerability, facilitating risk-informed decision-making on urban planning for tomorrow's cities. Next, we account for both physical and social networks within urban systems and their underlying vulnerabilities, and this allows us to represent impacts in terms of people-centered metrics, facilitating what we call a democratization of the concept of risk, and this will be discussed in subsequent slides. Now, this very conceptual version of the decision support environment was recently translated into a practical framework, and the risk engine features at the center of this framework. And this will be this topic of the discussion of the rest of the presentation. Now, this risk engine, as I mentioned, is a flexible risk modelling approach, capturing future people-centred natural hazard risk as part of urban planning. And it's a simulation-based approach, meaning that we can capture the uncertainties inherent in future projections of hazard, exposure and vulnerability, and the subsequent impact and risk representations. Now, let's demonstrate the risk engine using the Tomorrowville Virtual Urban Testbed that has been designed as part of the Tomorrow Cities project, using data from both Kathmandu and Nairobi to represent a generic global South city. Now, Tomorrowville sits on a flexible spatial geodatabase, meaning that we can flexibly consider multiple possible versions of the future urban system of Tomorrowville. The first step of the risk engine involves defining a specific representation of the future urban system of Tomorrowville. Now, this is a very detailed representation. We don't just capture buildings and other pieces of infrastructure. We also capture each individual that will live within the urban system, their specific characteristics and how they interact with the built environment. We then subject that very detailed representation of the future urban system to a high-fidelity, physics-based, multi-hazard modelling scenario, and then we quantify the impacts of the hazard on the physical environment. But we go one step further than conventional risk modelling approaches by also capturing social interactions with the built environment, given the very detailed information we store on each individual. And we can then understand how each individual's life is interrupted by damage caused by the hazard. Now, this all allows us to represent the impacts of future hazard events in very people-centered ways. Like, we can capture the number of people that will be displaced in future hazard events. And we can further disaggregate this in terms of income group because of that detailed information we've captured on each individual within the urban system. And this type of metric is much more informative on the whole impact that a disaster will have on everyone within society relative to a metric like economic loss, for instance. Now, once we've quantified these impact metrics, the next step involves taking the impact metrics to stakeholders and decision makers and allowing them to answer the following question. How important are the impact metrics to us? And this type of questioning and feedback facilitates what we call a groundbreaking democratization of the concept of risk. The idea that different impact metrics will matter differently to different people. Now, in the pro-poor approach that we promote in the Tomorrow Cities project, we would expect decision makers to prioritize the minimization of low-income displacement relative to high-income displacement. And we can capture that in our framework through what we call an agreed risk function that accounts not just for the values of the impact metrics, but also their relative importance to particular stakeholders and decision makers. And once we have this function quantified, the result is what we call the agreed risk value. And this agreed risk value can be compared across different future versions of Tomorrowville in order to determine the optimal future version and the underlying urban plan that will lead to the lowest value of agreed risk. Now, in conclusion, we've developed this innovative decision support environment with a risk engine at its heart that overcomes a number of the limitations of existing risk modelling approaches. And we've successfully demonstrated that risk engine using the Tomorrowville Virtual Urban Testbed. Thank you very much for listening.